Wrestling doesn't have to be just one thing. Sure, it can be a territorial-era sports contest, but at the same time, it can just as easily be an acrobatic Cirque du Soleil-style feat, a hardcore weapons brawl, or sports entertainment soap opera. And when none of these work, sometimes it can just be straight up funny, something which each of today's subjects will be more than familiar with, as collectively, they have given us some of the most genuinely laugh-out-loud moments in the industry's history. So, join us today as we take a closer look at some of the funniest performers of all time in Kings of Comedy, Wrestling's Funniest Characters. And if we're starting somewhere, then why not start right at the top, because despite the popular conception amongst some that being funny doesn't draw money, one of the biggest stars in wrestling history, The Rock, was able to make fans laugh with his antics week in and week out. Sure, when the time for the match came, he'd be all business, but upon turning heel and morphing into WWE's chief cocky badass in the late 90s, Dwayne Johnson would unveil a side to himself which made him one of the company's most beloved babyfaces. And these laughs would often take place during his legendary promos which saw him do things like mock the Big Show during a slow-motion instant replay segment on an episode of SmackDown in early 2000, or Billy Gunn during the lead-up to their match at the 1999 King of the Ring, or just generally trash-talk backstage interviewers such as Kevin Kelly and Michael Cole. On top of that, during this time, the future Hollywood star would come up with a seemingly endless number of killer catchphrases, each funnier than the last, and every one only making him more money in merchandise sales. But it wasn't just on the mic that he killed it, as, even when he was in the ring, he could make people laugh with his often ludicrous sells of the Stone Cold Stunner or his increasingly elaborate ways of performing the People's Elbow, the best of which is still probably the time he slid across the ring in dress shoes before dropping it on the British Bulldog. Then, when he went Hollywood years later, the Great One's comedy skills would get a chance to be exposed to an even greater audience when he starred in the likes of The Rundown, Central Intelligence, and Pain and Gain. That said though, perhaps his best comedic work of all would come while he was still in WWE, working an odd couple tag team alongside our next subject, Mick Foley. Yes, the Rock and Sock connection can probably still go down to this day as one of the funniest tag teams in wrestling history, giving us, as they did, a number of legendary segments like the This Is Your Life one in September of 1999. Of course, Mrs. Foley's baby boy was no stranger to making people laugh before this though, because with Dude Love being introduced to WWE audiences a couple of years prior, he'd get his first chance to show a lighter side of himself, one separate from the hardcore legend status he picked up while working as Cactus Jack over in Japan. And when in 1999 Mankind shifted more towards a comedic character, Mick would develop a new addition for him in the form of Mr. Sacco, a sock puppet which had originally been created to make Vince McMahon feel better following his kayfabe broken ankle at the hands of the Brothers of Destruction. But Mr. Sacco would end up lasting far longer than just one segment as it happened, because from there, it would become a key part of Mankind's act, delighting fans every time it was pulled out of his tights and shoved down the throat of some poor, unsuspecting opponent. And even when Foley retired in 2000, he'd still get a chance to bring the funny, because he'd then move over to the role of on-screen commissioner, there getting to put on some genuinely hilarious segments backstage every week as his constantly traveling office played host to scenes of him verbally sparring with the likes of Triple H, Edge, and Christian. But for as great as Mick was, he wouldn't be the only person in WWE who would manage to get a sock puppet over, as years later, Santino Marella would do the same. Rather than name his puppet Mr. Sacco though, Santino would instead call his the Cobra, with it often taking control over him as he tried his best to corral his wayward hand into doing what he wanted. And this led to many funny scenes over his run with the company between 2007 and 2016, scenes which would often see his bemused opponents wonder exactly how they'd gotten themselves in such a situation. Not that this worried him though, as, by letting his comedy skills shine, Santino was able to carve out a role for himself as one of the most entertaining parts of WWE every week during this period, with some of his other great moments including his attempts to mimic Melina's Splits ring entrance, his weekly honkometer after winning the Intercontinental title, and perhaps best of all, his tea party with Sheamus and Vladimir Kozlov on the November 9th, 2010 episode of Raw. Still though, for as great of a comedy character as Santino was, he wasn't the best the company had during the 2010s, as our next subject, R-Truth, probably holds that spot. Yes, when it comes to pure laughs, R-Truth might just be the funniest character in WWE history. He's certainly the longest serving, with him continuing to keep a spot on the show for over 2 decades now, something which serves as tribute to his skills. And during this time, some of his best comedy moments have seen him do things like introduce audiences to an invisible child named Little Jimmy, act as a temporary stunt double for Dolph Ziggler, and even get confused when he tried to climb a ladder to success during the Royal Rumble match one year. Maybe best of all, though, would be the time he interrupted a trash-talking session between all the entrants in the 2015 Money in the Bank match, explaining to them all that he was going to be the one to win it, only for him to then be informed by Kane that he wasn't even in the match. Pure comedy gold. And he's still going strong today. R-Truth can hold a claim to being the best comedy character in wrestling, even now, though he does have a challenger for this in the form of Chris Jericho. And part of the reason for this is that whatever decade it is and whatever company he's in, Y2J has consistently been one of the funniest people in the industry, something which goes all the way back to his days in World Championship Wrestling when, upon believing there was a conspiracy to hold him down, he would go on rants throughout the streets of Washington with his assistant Ralphus in tow, trying to gather others to his cause. On top of that, in another memorable segment during this period, he'd at one point get lost while on his way to the ring during an episode of Nitro, aping the similarly hilarious scene in This Is Spinal Tap. Perhaps best of all, though, would be the time that in an attempt to prove he was a better wrestler than Dean Malenko, he'd come out to the ring with a ridiculously long list of moves, beginning to read them from there as the show went to a commercial. Then, when Nitro returned, he was still at it, presumably having been reading from his list of holds the whole time, a list which included the likes of the moss-covered three-handle family Gradunzel, the Saskatchewan spinning nerve hold, and multiple instances of arm bars. And if anyone thought the humor would be turned down when he joined WWF in 1999, they were wrong, as there, while working his way up to the level of main eventer and eventual undisputed champion, he'd still find time to make fans laugh with his promos which regularly saw him take aims at the likes of Stephanie McMahon, Chris Benoit, and, as he likes to put it, Kirk Angel. Hell, even during his latter runs with the company in the 2010s, a time when he'd long since morphed into a more serious figure, he was still one of the funniest people on the show, utilizing the likes of the lists to get a giggle from those in attendance week in and week out. And this willingness to make people laugh was never more evident than in his run with Kevin Owens, a run which saw the two portray dastardly heels involved in a bromance and which would climax in one of the best segments in recent Raw history, the Festival of Friendship. Since that point, however, he's left WWE behind and joined All Elite Wrestling where, now acting in more of an elder statesman role, he's continued to flex his comedy chops during the likes of his feud with Orange Cassidy, his Les Sex Gods team with Sammy Guevara, and his award-winning musical segment with MJF titled Les Dîners Debonair, each of which have seen him morph into the persona of a more comically outdated 80s rock star in the vein of Nikki Sixx, John Bon Jovi, or Steven Tyler. So it seems like, for some time to come at least, Chris Jericho will still be riding high as one of the best entertainers in the wrestling industry. And as it happens, the same can still be said for one of his current AEW co-workers and chief rivals during the early 2000s, William Regal. Yes, growing up in Blackpool, England, where pantomime was a big influence, William Regal was never afraid to make himself look stupid in the ring in order to get a laugh. Not that he wasn't a great wrestler, though, no, quite the opposite, in fact, because when you break down the greatest in-ring workers of all time, he probably still ranks among the top tier even to this day. When he wasn't breaking bones with his brutal British strong style, though, he was pulling off some of the best comedy performances in the industry's history, many of which came during his run as an on-screen commissioner in WWF during the early 2000s. And among these highlights, there would be his odd couple pairing with Tajiri, his joining of the Vince McMahon Kiss My Ass Club, and the time Chris Jericho urinated into his tea, causing the Englishman to pull a face that looked like it was made of plasticine. More than any of these, however, William Regal can hold claim to having maybe the most legitimately laugh-out-loud funny moment in wrestling history when, on an episode of SmackDown in 2000, he'd come out to the ring to rile the crowd up by reading Hamlet in its entirety. Unfortunately for him, though, right as he was getting into it, Stone Cold Steve Austin's music would hit, and the Rattlesnake would from there make his way down to the ring to deliver a casual stunner to Regal, only to then get back up and walk out without his theme song ever cutting off. Even to this day, it still makes us laugh. And in recent years, after going through a run as NXT's general manager, William Regal has moved over to AEW where, now acting as the manager of the Blackpool Combat Club, he's gotten to merge the two parts of his personality, letting his sadistic side shine as he tries to motivate the likes of Wheeler Yuta to develop a killer instinct, all while also getting to sit in on the commentary booth during his stables matches and throw out some great one-liner responses to his fellow broadcasters Excalibur, Jim Ross, and Tony Schiavone. Yes, in terms of the ability to veer between comedic and serious, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who can match up to the Blackpool native, but one person who might be able to say they've done it better than him is one of the biggest stars of the Attitude Era and beyond, Kurt Angle. Sure, when most people think of Kurt Angle, the first thing that comes to their mind is probably the tough son of a bitch who won an Olympic gold medal with a broken freaking neck. And this is a side to his personality he certainly got to show at various points throughout his run in both WWE and TNA. That said, when he needed to, he could also play an absolute buffoon to perfection, all while managing to maintain his air of legitimacy in the process. And this is particularly impressive because he went comedy, he went all in, with this attitude he had towards the lighter side of wrestling becoming clear to fans during his initial run with Vince McMahon's promotion in the early 2000s. There, in fact, he would start off by playing the delusional heel, one who thought that being a bona fide Olympic hero, fans should respect his Boy Scout ways of saying your prayers, taking your vitamins, and drinking your milk. During the Attitude Era, though, this would only cause fans to hate him, with Angle only too happy to play this dorky character to the hills for maximum heat in the years that followed. And this would see him team with Edge and Christian at points to form a brilliant comedy trio, one which, despite being heels, almost got over as babyfaces at various times because of how entertaining they were. Then, when the invasion happened in 2001 and Kurt found himself on the same side as Steve Austin, they would become one of the most unexpected comedy acts in wrestling, with each one still proving to be a badass when they needed to be, albeit ones who could create some genuinely hilarious backstage skits, such as the time the Olympian, in an attempt to win Vince McMahon's affections, poorly tried to serenade him with a rendition of Jimmy Crack Corn. As well as that, there was also the time when, trying to embarrass his frenemy, the Rattlesnake would buy him a child's cowboy hat, only to be bemused when Angle ended up loving it. And when the two started a feud later that year upon Austin's defection to the Alliance, Kurt would prove to be a legitimate main event force, even while being able to work in the occasional comedy segment, such as his milk bath attack on WCW and ECW. After that, he'd spend the mid-2000s becoming a multiple-time world champion, moving between his serious wrestling machine persona and the more comedic side of himself that saw him get into a rap battle with John Cena and deliver a memorable rendition of Sexy Kurt during the build-up to his WrestleMania 21 match with Shawn Michaels. Then, once his time with WWE ended in 2006, he'd move over to TNA where, starting a whole new second chapter of his career, he'd mostly lean into his more serious side. That said though, on occasion, he would still move towards comedy, and this would even continue upon his return to Vince McMahon's company in 2017 where, in some of his more unintentionally funny moments, he would provide modern audiences with some meme-worthy images such as his out-of-place dad smile when appearing as part of The Shield at the 2018 Survivor Series, and his bemused, oblivious whistling face right before he was punched in the face by Triple H on an episode of Raw during the lead-up to WrestleMania 33. But none of his comedic abilities should come as a surprise because when Kurt was first breaking into the business, he was able to learn from some of the best of them. And one of his most memorable opponents during this period, Eddie Guerrero, could be funnier than almost anyone else when he needed to be. Of course, any fan of WWE during the mid-2000s will know all about Latino Heat's ability to make people laugh, but as it happened, this didn't always come naturally to him, as during his early years in the likes of CMLL, AAA, and WCW, he would instead be an excellent wrestler who often struggled to find his personality. Upon joining WWE in 2000, though, that would all change, as there, Eddie would blossom into a full-blown character, one who first gained popularity amongst fans as the lover of China, his mamacita. And as part of a double act with the ninth wonder of the world, then, Latino Heat would quickly rise up the ranks, with the only thing at the time able to stop him being his personal drug issues. Once he cleaned himself up of those then, he'd start another comedy union, this time with his nephew Chavo, as they became known as Los Guerreros, a couple of cheeky scoundrels who, despite acting in a heelish manner, would always do it with enough of a wink and a nod that fans continued to love them anyway. In fact, it was during this time that Eddie would introduce some of his most common forms of getting the better of his opponents, such as throwing his steel chair into their hands when the referee's back was turned, then laying down as if he'd been hit. And while he wasn't doing that, he was always drawing a laugh with his backstage segments that frequently saw him and Chavo do things such as pretend to be valets and then steal people's cars, lie about being pool cleaners only to then throw a backyard party in someone's garden, and even lie, cheat, and steal their way to victory during a golf game. That said, all the laughs would come to an end in November of 2005, as it would be then that Eddie would tragically die of a heart attack at just 38 years old. And sadly, he's not alone in that respect, as another of the most notoriously funny wrestlers of all time, Owen Hart, would also die young. Before that tragedy occurred, though, the youngest Hart brother had built a reputation amongst his peers as being perhaps the single most beloved figure in the industry, with his backstage ribs becoming legendary over the years. And these ribs would see him do things like filling up Vince McMahon's office with a bunch of pigs and letting them do their business, making Ahmed Johnson believe he'd been booked on The Tonight Show, and selling a blow from a bag of popcorn like a shotgun blast at a house show. But of course, even when the cameras were on, Owen's funny side would still come out frequently, as after he turned heel on his brother Bret in 1994, he'd still be able to bring the laughs by doing things such as carrying his 2 stolen Slammy awards down to the ring with him as if they were world titles, or even celebrate like he'd won the Olympic gold after pulling off a simple move on the Hitman during their match at WrestleMania 10. Even during his final days, he still valued entertaining fans above all else, something which was evident in the fact that, rather than work his way up the card into a main event program, he would take on the comedy role of the Blue Blazer, a bumbling wannabe superhero who was constantly embarrassing and outing himself despite Owen's repeated claims that he was not the man under the mask. But as we all know, this would mark the last run of his career as, while portraying the Blue Blazer at May 23, 1999's Over the Edge pay-per-view, the youngest Hart would die during a rappelling accident. Still, even if he was gone, the memory of all the comedic moments he'd left for both his fans and his peers would live on, and one of the figures who carried on the torch of being a great wrestler who could also be funny was Booker T. That's right, Booker T, despite being a 5-time WCW champion, a 1-time World Heavyweight champion, and a 2-time Hall of Famer, remains to this day one of the funniest people to ever set foot inside a wrestling ring. And this wasn't something he had to develop over time either, as way back in his WCW days, he was bringing the laughs, albeit sometimes unintentionally, during moments such as his bemused look upon finding a framed photo of Scott Hall during the Vince Russo-booked San Francisco 49ers match on an episode of Nitro in 2000. Then, when he came over to WWE during the Invasion in 2001, he'd add more goofy comedy elements to his character, with these being on full-on display during his famous supermarket brawl with Stone Cold Steve Austin later that year. After that, he'd continue to make people laugh during his infamously ridiculous feud with Edge at WrestleMania 18 that saw the two beef over who was going to get the job in a shampoo commercial, all before causing even more guffaws when he had a memorable odd couple team-up with Goldust later in 2002. And this pairing would lead to some of the best backstage segments of the era. In the end, though, this worked out for them, as so popular would the 5-time WCW champion become with fans, by 2006, he would have started a main event run over on SmackDown after winning King of the Ring. And this would see him play perhaps his funniest role yet when he donned a crown and scepter, and then, with a poorly done English accent, proclaimed himself to be King Booker. Following that, the new self-proclaimed ruler of the SmackDown Kingdom would build a court of heels around himself as, week in and week out, he acted more and more cartoonish, with this eventually leading to him becoming World Heavyweight Champion later that year. But even when he eventually left WWE in 2007, Booker would continue to bring laughs when he joined Total Nonstop Action Wrestling, there at one point introducing the world to Black Snow during his time in the commentary booth. And since his return to WWE in recent years, he's continued to be a funny presence on pay-per-view pre-shows, proving that no matter how old he gets, he can still make people laugh just as much as ever, something which solidifies his spot amongst the group of people we've looked at today, as each of them, in their own ways, can make a true claim to being the funniest people in all of wrestling. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.